Hello, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome to the FAPESP COVID-19 research webinar series with the topic value-based behavior under COVID-19. This is the sixth webinar of this series organized by FAPESP, the São Paulo Research Foundation, and supported by the Global Research Council. This webinar will focus on human behavior during the pandemic, which can be both part of the problem, that is the spread of the virus, and part of the solution, now and even after a vaccine is made available. But first of all, I invite you to welcome the Scientific Director of FAPESP, Dr. Luiz Eugênio Mello, for his welcome address and opening the webinar. Professor Luiz, the screen is yours.
Obrigado, Daisy. Good morning, or good afternoon, or good night to you all. It's a pleasure to have you here with us, our distinguished guests, Professor Ortwinn Renn, Professor Marta Hubner, and Paulo Borgio, and the other colleagues. As we know, of course, we all would wish vaccine would be readily available and we would have no problems with dealing with COVID, and life would go on as before. That's not the case, and to cope with the current situation, it's of great importance that we better understand how our behaviors influence the development of the disease and how we can modify our behaviors in order not only to cope with the current pandemic, but also to learn more about what we are and how we as social beings may contribute to the well-being of one another. So the basic idea behind the current webinar, it's definitely associated with COVID-19, but definitely the knowledge that we will hear today and that we may develop in the future might contribute not only to understand how to cope with COVID-19, but how to better develop our society and our relationships. So once again, thank you all for being here. And please, Professor Daisy, the screen is yours.
Thank you very much, Professor Luiz Mello. Before moving on to the presentations, I would like to share some details about how this webinar will work. First, each speaker will have 20 minutes to make his or her presentation. Next, we will have a discussion panel. Our guests will answer questions from the audience. They may also debate issues raised by panel members. Your questions and comments will be very welcome. You can send them by email using the address live@fapesp.br. Finally, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available later at the Agência FAPESP YouTube channel. Thank you for joining us today and enjoy the talks. As mentioned before, the topic today is value-based behavior under COVID-19. The research webinar is composed of a strong team of 4 experts in social and behavioral sciences, who will address the factors that affect human behavior with a special emphasis on compliance or non-compliance with the guidelines issued by health and government authorities to prevent the spread of COVID-19. We are very happy to have the 4 of them with us this morning, and I'd like once again to thank them all for accepting the FAPESP invitation. Our first speaker will be Dr. Ortwinn Renn. He is the scientific director. Sorry, I lost my screen, just a minute. Dr. Ortwinn is the scientific director of the International Institute for Advanced Sustainability Studies, IASS in Germany. He teaches environmental sociology and technology assessment at the University of Stuttgart, and he also directs the nonprofit company Dialogik, a research institute for the investigation of communication and participation processes. His research interests include risk governance, perception analysis, communication, stakeholder and public involvement in environmental decision-making, transformation processes in economics, politics, and society, and sustainable development. Dr. Renn has published more than 30 monographs and over 250 peer-reviewed articles. His most prominent English publication is the book Risk Governance, Coping with Uncertainty in a Complex World. His talk is entitled Behavioral Response Towards COVID-19 Threats and Governmental Measures, What Triggers Compliance? Dr. Renn, thank you again for joining us and sharing your ideas. The screen is yours.
Yeah, many thanks, Daisy, for this very nice introduction. And I am very delighted to be here in this webinar and to share some of my thoughts with this distinguished audience here. And I would like to pick up two major points. One is the point is what triggers actually behavioral responses in the COVID-19 crisis. And secondly, what is the compliance rate in various countries towards governmental measures, and why do we see so many differences between countries, but also in between groups within a single country? I would like to start out with the issue of the various responses that we can see to the COVID-19 threat. And I would like to structure this into three various elements. The first element are the psychological responses, the second one, the more socio-political ones, and the third one, the more cultural ones. And let me start with the psychological ones. We have a lot of research showing that many individuals have a specific propensity to either a person that prefers to flee when they face threats, or that they are persons that fight when they're getting acquainted or confronted with a threat, or that are ignorant and what we sometimes say play dead in light of a crisis that comes across them. And these three major elements of responses, so you can see flee, fight, or ignore, are very pertinent among many populations in the world. And a lot of anthropologists think that they are almost generically given, and they're not totally distributed among individuals differently, but some individuals tend more to one or the other of the three major or basic response schemes. Why is this important? What we can see is that we have roughly a third to sometimes 40% of the population who feels very threatened and is likely to take very much protective action, even to the extent that it may increase risks from, for example, dehydration or not good nourishment. So they, of course, they don't collect food from the outside world. And that could be a danger in itself, but basically they feel very threatened and they like to retreat to areas in which they fear or which they believe they don't have more risks to face. The opposite group is the one that is trying to fight the disease, and those are the ones that either say, well, the disease is not there, and I'll get back to it, why some groups believe that or not, or that they have to do something against the virus, but because they cannot fight the virus directly, it's too small, and they're not, scientists that can do this, they use substitute objects, scapegoats. And we see all over the world that a lot of people, maybe 10 to 15%, trying to find scapegoats for the disease. And that could be foreigners, that could be whatever, people from the political left or right or whatsoever. So you're trying to find some scapegoats that you can attack because you feel you cannot do anything about the virus. And then the third group is a group of people who ignore this threat and basically believe they're invulnerable if they just don't do any major action. So they just do as if the threat were not there. And that, of course, is in a sense dangerous because they could be super spreaders, because unwillingly, because they feel they're invulnerable, they can but still, be one of the group of the population that carries the infection from one person to the next. This is a part of the individual setup, and any kind of governmental action or communication needs to include the three basic response patterns, and they need also different types of communication. The person who is likely to flee, to go to remote places, or to lock him or herself up in its own apartment, may need some encouragement. No, you have to go out, you have to buy food, you have all kinds of these things. So don't overdo it. The person who fights, then very often you have to make sure that that person is not attacking something that has nothing to do with the virus. But again, be protective to oneself. And the third person needs to be really strongly addressed to say, okay, even if you feel yourself to be, you could still be a carrier for the virus, and that could then, it could contract other people who will be then exposed to the virus because of you. And using those different communication skills is sometimes difficult because you don't know exactly to which group your individual audience belongs to. Let me then go quickly. I know there are more psychological aspects that need to include, but those are the three that I think are most important. Now, the socio-political is the next level, and there we can see that the virus and its impact can be easily politicized or can be socialized by various power groups in society. And we can see this very strongly in the United States, and you also have seen it in Brazil and in other countries in which it becomes a matter of a political debate. And it's not the measures, it's really the virus itself. Is it a threat or is it not a threat? Should we go back to normal execution of our daily exercises and habits, or should we do really a lot in terms of protection? And then the whole issue becomes polarized, and then we see all kind of echo chambers and others in the social media, where the groups who really feel it's not a threat and this is all not very important, and the group that feels it's extremely important separate. And then we have a third kind of group evolving. Those are all the conspiracy theories, where they cannot live with the uncertainty that's going around with this virus infection, and so trying to find a story with meaning, and very often that then goes into conspiracy theories. And the third thing which is important, and that also leads already to my second part about compliance, is that we have strongly cultural differences. If you look all over the world, we can see that East Asian countries, China, but it's not just about the political system, which they believe it is, but that probably not. It's more the mentality. Taiwan, Japan, Korea, all these countries have very, very little problems after they had the first wave. And when we can look at them, we see that there's a culture that the collective has priority over the individual. And that's true independent of the system. We have, democratic system, Japan, Taiwan, and Korea. We have a more autocratic system in China. But all of these countries have in common that the collective good has a very strong impetus, a very strong incentive for people to behave according to what they believe is good for the public good. And that, of course, is very much related in the corona crisis to wearing masks, to keeping distances, to accepting all kind of electronic devices that tell me if I'm under threat or not. We can see that other countries in Europe, United States, and partially also South America have a more and stronger individualistic touch to this, and saying, so what is it for me as an individual? And if I feel like I'm belonging to this third group of people who ignore the risk, I can just not wear masks because I don't think I'm vulnerable or I don't believe in the virus whatsoever, and take this also part of their personal freedom to do that. And that, of course, makes a lot of differences in the sense of first and second, even third wave that we are experiencing in the COVID crisis. And that brings me to my second point, the real compliance issue. I think we need this kind of picture where you can see we have differences as individuals. We have a politicization scheme in which this issue has been politicized over time and has become a part of a partisan strategy. And thirdly, we have a cultural overtone of individualistic versus collective behavior. And all three aspects have a strong impact on the overall compliance rates. What we can see is that in collectively defined societies, it's enough if the government has basically the trust of the people. That was not given in the beginning in China. We can see that, and it was a lot of mismanagement. But once the federal government actually took care of it, then the trust seemed to come back. And we can see it very closely in Korea, in Japan, and also in Taiwan, where people trusted the governmental measures. And within that kind of a collective mood of serving the common good, the compliance rate were in all these countries extremely high. Where you can see compliance rates, I mean, there are some numerical studies which show that 80 or 90% of people comply with all the rules and have no problems with privacy, for example, in Korea very strongly. I mean, these apps can track wherever you are and the government can see where you are, but it was not a big problem for the Koreans. If you go to other countries like my own country, Germany, such an app would not be accepted. That's just a violation of privacy, even under the threat of COVID-19, something that would not be accepted. And the courts would probably also not give their approval for such a device. So when we go out of this kind of cultural group that where compliance is almost something that's a part of the national cultural DNA, we can see if you come to Europe, that it also, we have some countries like Sweden and Norway and Denmark, which have strong trust and central governments, again, where we can see that people really did a lot voluntarily. They didn't have to be forced to it. Sweden has a little bit mixed picture in terms of compliance, but generally it's fairly compliant. If you go to the other countries, France, Italy, Germany, UK, with a different history in terms of how they strove, but nevertheless, they have in common that the government is more or less trusted, but they have to put a lot of effort into making sure that people perceive the measures first to be effective, secondly, as being proportional, and thirdly, as being fair. If that was the case, compliance was pretty high. We can see high correlation coefficients between these three perceptive patterns. Do people believe, okay, that's effective, we should actually do it? Secondly, is it proportional? Do we see that the threat is big enough that these kinds of measures are really justified and legitimized? And thirdly, is it fair? Is it something that everybody has his or her burden to take and everybody is also benefiting from this? If that is challenged, then we can see that groups start to become more adamant. They become partially even more progressive. You see protest movements in many of the European countries in which a smaller part of the population, but still a sizable part of maybe 5 to 7%, are not believing either that the virus is even very dangerous, but furthermore that all these measures are not proportional, that they're unfair to them, and that even some believe they're not effective. And then they get a lot of social unrest and protests, as we've seen in Italy, in France, Germany, less so in the UK at this point. But in all over Europe, we can see that 70 to 80% are believing it's effective, more or less fair and proportional. 20% is more in doubt, and of them, around 6 to 8% believe it is not fair, it is not proportional, and then we have a lot of opposition. I'm not totally sure about South America, so I've just looked at some of the numbers there, and I think there's something similar here also. I think South America has a strong individualistic attitude, so individual values have a strong impact on it, but you see a stronger measure, specifically in Brazil, for politicization between the government and the opposition, but also between different groups in society. So that comes across, and then if people are already politicized, then they delineate it, it's not proportional or it's not effective or whatsoever. So we have first a kind of cleavage towards one or the other camp, and then the belief system are basically adjusted to it. Lastly, what I think is an important element in all of this is that these kind of measures have a specific dynamic over time. And we can see if we look at the first wave, I mean, people were very much threatened and felt risk perception was fairly high in Germany, but also in most of the United States in the beginning, Brazil and somewhere else. Then we had the time of politicization, United States very clearly that the administration basically downplayed the threat. Same thing happened in Brazil, same thing happened in several other countries, but then had to correct it more or less over time because the pressure was too strong. And the compliance there was, not as good as maybe many European countries, but it was starting to, because people saw the problems, that they were more or less complying. The second wave that started then in Europe, it just started, in the United States started something earlier. People got more used to the threat, and very often call this a decalibration of normality. So it becomes normal that coronavirus is around us. And if it gets a third or fourth wave, it will even get more normal. And then it's much more difficult to understand or to make judgment about the proportionality of measures. Because people say, oh yes, now that we have the virus around for a couple of years or for a lot of months, we don't know anyone who really died, or we know one or two, but most of the people they know are fine. So let's just continue like normal, and then it becomes much more difficult to legitimize governmental action. So my view on the future is basically that unless we have a very effective vaccine coming up, when of course things will change more dramatically, and the recalibration then will go back to what we think was normal before the virus. Otherwise, I think that it will gradually kind of have less and less compliance for governmental measures if you get to a third or fourth wave, and more acceptance of yes, disease and even of a death due to coronavirus, because we're getting more familiar with this picture that yes, it's a deadly disease. I mean, it's not killing millions of people in a country, but it's killing a lot. But nevertheless, life could go on. So my vision for the future is either we get a vaccine that is then effective over time, and may take 6 months to really deliver to everyone, but then we can recalibrate to normality, or the other way around, normality which will be recalibrated to a coexistence of society with the COVID-19. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Renn, for such a comprehensive and instigating talk. We hope to listen to you again at the discussion panel. Our next speaker is Dr. Martha Hübner. We had to change a little bit here, the sequence of presentations. So we are going to Marta. Marta Hübner is a full professor at the São Paulo University, where she coordinates the Laboratory for the Study of Verbal Operands. She is also the coordinator of CAIS, a Center for Autism and Social Inclusion at USP Institute of Psychology. And she is Chief of Psychology Service at University Hospital at USP. Dr. Hübner's background is experimental psychology and behavior analysis, and she has an extensive experience as a behavior therapist. She is a member of the National Institute of Science and Technology on Behavior, Cognition, and Teaching, and her research interests include symbolic behavior, verbal behavior, reading acquisition, autism, and behavior therapy. Dr. Hübner has published scientific papers and books on her research topics. She has also actively participated in scientific societies in Brazil and abroad. She was a former president of the Brazilian Psychological Association, twice president of the Brazilian Association of Psychology and Behavioral Medicine, and international representative and president of the Association for Behavior Analysis International, ABAI. From ABAI, she received the award for international dissemination of behavior analysis. During the pandemic, Dr. Hübner is also often invited to talk in live events organized by several scientific societies and groups, and to give live interviews at TV channels, thus working intensively in the dissemination of scientific knowledge on principles of behavior and how they support coping with COVID-19. The title of her talk today is "With No Vaccine and Facing an Invisible Virus, the Treatment is Behavioral, Identifying and Managing the Contingencies that Act on People During the COVID-19 Pandemic." Thank you, Dr. Marta Hübner. Once again, it's a privilege to have you here talking about this topic. The screen is yours.
Thank you, Dr. Deisy de Souza, for such a generous introduction. Thank you to FAPESP for this honorable invitation in the name of Dr. Luiz Eugênio de Mello. I'm very, very proud to be here. So as Dr. Deisy de Souza just presented, I'm going to talk about individual perspectives and with the concept of contingencies, which I'm going to explain all over my talk. So I'm a behavior analyst, so I'm going to present to you our model of explanation, the way we view and the way we define and the way we research our events. So our model is inspired by Darwin. It's the selection by consequence model of explanation, and it proposed the notion of operant behavior. This notion states that an organism, the individual acts, behaves, operates on the environment, modifying it, the environment, and being modified by it. So the behavior we are analyzing here is a natural phenomenon, and it's selected by its consequences. Our unit of analysis is what we call technically a three-term contingency. Three-term contingencies is analysis instruments through which we observe the interaction between environment and behavior. And when we do so, 3 points we have to analyze. The occasion in which the response occurs, so the context, the situation upon which the response will occur, where the people, where person will behave, and the consequence, the reinforcing consequence that can be aversive or positive or agreeable. So the interrelationships between them are what we call contingencies of reinforcement. So here it is, very simple, but very elegant. We have the previous situation, the context, the situation, what we call antecedent stimulus. We have the response, the action of the individual, and the consequent that comes afterwards, the response of the individual. So here, during our pandemic days, the COVID-19, we have a very fragile three-term contingencies. I'm going to explain you why. The problem starts with consequences, the third term. For example, if you have the situation of a person using a mask and asks you to wear a mask, you can wear a mask, you comply, but the consequence of your compliance is not right there because you are not sure the natural consequence is to be protected, for example, but you don't see it right afterwards. You are not sure if you are infected or not, if you are using the right way for the right time of use. So the consequence, the most important part of the three-term contingent is not there. Or because the virus is invisible, you do not see, or because it's in the air, in the surface, in many places, not only in persons. Also, the consequences are delayed. For example, when you sanitize with 700 alcohol, you cannot be sure whether you eliminated the virus or not. There is no clearly differential consequence for appropriate behavior, for example, using the mask or sanitizing, or not appropriate behavior. You're not sure if what you did is with the correct consequence. And besides that, we have asymptomatic cases. So even if you were feeling good, maybe you have the virus and maybe you can infect somebody else. So according to our thousands of researchers in behavior analysis, delayed consequences like that are less effective than immediate ones. And also, these kind of consequences are unpredictable in terms that you don't know when it's going to occur because you don't know exactly that if you were doing can prevent it really, right? So when this happens, it can create a kind of emotion called anxiety. So we have thousands of researchers showing this experimental model of anxiety paradigm. Because suppose that the virus is a kind of unavoidable or unpredictable adversity event, so the responses seems to be ineffective. So it begins to emerge a conditional suppression of responses. You stop to do things that maybe had the right consequence. And also an increasement of respondents. And if times goes by and nothing happens to you, also it can emerge what some authors call the paradox of avoidance behavior. Things are very well, so the decrease of compliance can occur. Also, we have problems with responses, which is in the middle of the three-term contingencies. Why? Because we have many multiple new responses that need to be taught. Instructions are not enough. It's not enough to say, get away from people from 2 meters, wash your hands in this case or that case, use masks, and stay home if you can. So these multiple new responses need to be trained, need to be showed, need to be shaped. And multiple responses that need also to be positively reinforced. Social praise has to have consequence because the virus is invisible. So you have a social network teaching you, helping you to cope this and to do that. So it has to be trained, those multiple new responses, in analogous situation, not in real ones. You cannot be training in the supermarket or pharmacy because the danger is right there. So you have to have simulations, analogous situation. And also it requires time to be learned and to become stable with no errors. It's not something that happens in 1 or 2 months. It could be quick like that, but it has to occur in a process, in the time. And also the response we have to learn to be away from people, sometimes it's incongruous, incongruent with feelings. So you have to be away from your stepson, from your son, from your grandson. And it's hard. It's hard to feel that your daughter, your son brings danger to you. So it's a hard learning process. Also, we have problems with the context, with the antecedent, the first term. We have complexity and contradiction, acting upon the situation where we have to decide what to do. And talking about this kind of contradiction, we have the politicians saying something in Brazil. You already know that our president says, no, it's nothing. COVID-19 is just a little flu. And the World Health Organization telling us it's a serious problem, stay home as much as you can, get away from people, physical distance. We have here in Brazil a contradiction between federal and state government, how a professor before told that politicization of the virus. And also we have a complexity, enormous complexity in multiple and different contexts, where we have to decide what to do to not be contaminated or infected. For example, according to the table published by the British Medical Journal, you have a 44 situation where you have to decide if you stay or you go, if you put the mask or not. For example, you can have 3 levels of risks: low, medium, or high. If you are with mask, but the contact is long, you have also to look at the low occupation or high occupation. So the number of people you are with. Also, you have to analyze your response, your behavior. If you are in silence, if you are talking, if you are singing or screaming. So if you are with mask, long contact, and inside with low ventilation, the risk is high. But if you are outside, and even if you sing or scream, the risk is low. With high occupation, you have 3 situations with very high risk. So this is one scenario. Another scenario, if you are with mask and a short contact, you have a very low risk with low occupation outside or inside, and a medium risk if the ventilation is low. If you are in a high occupation environment, you have some medium risks and a very high risk if the ventilation is low. Also, without mask and short contact, if you are outside in silence or talking, you can have a low risk. But if you are singing or screaming in low ventilation, you can get infected. Or, of course, all of this analysis is for asymptomatic persons. So in this case, low ventilation and singing and screaming, we have a famous case of infection in a group of people who was in a choir inside a church. They were singing and 60% got the virus. With high occupation, you have many situations with high risk of transmission. And without mask, long contact, it's the most dangerous situation. So here you say many reds situations where you can get the virus. So the person, besides having no consequence, besides having to learn multiple response, the person has to analyze all of this. So the problem with this scenario, with the antecedent stimulus, is that when consequences are delayed and responses are difficult, another factor comes, the verbal behavior control. So rules, instructions, persuasion, values. So what people say has more impact upon us because the consequences are not there and because it's so confusion. So to be effective, verbal behavior control has to be clear and persuasive and has to announce positive reinforcers, so good things that you're going to get doing the appropriate behavior during COVID-19, as well as to announce subversive consequences, bad things. So it has to be simple rules with no contradictions. One of the TV channels in Brazil has been playing a good role in this, putting every day a nice speech, announcing the good things, showing the bad things, showing people crying and dying. And so it's a way of announcing aversive and announcing positive behaviors. And so as the World Health Association says, the instructions has to be to act as the future is here, because the future has to be very dangerous if we get infected, and it's going to be too late. So as the OMS says, we have to act as if we were infected. So with this scenario, complexity and contradiction, another important comes, the empowerment of language. So awareness can come through language, and language for us, behavior analysts, it plays the role in the first term. It's something, a rule, a value, a norm, an instruction that is gonna signal what I have to do and what are the consequences. So we have been studying this, and self-describing verbal behavior is very special interest for many reasons, because with the acquisition of this kind of behavior of self-describing, the speaker can become aware of what he's doing or what he's saying and why. So when we describe this three-term contingency in a proper way, we can follow the instructions, the self-instructions. Why? Because verbal behavior can be a condition to the correspondence with actions. So verbal communities that we belong, we learn to establish certain correspondence between words and events. So this kind of correspondence we learn since we are a child, operate in both directions. We can name the things we see, we learn to name and to describe, and we can find, the things we name. So when we talk about things, we can see things, and in front of the things we can see, and we can act upon them according to what we say. So if somebody else shape our own verbal behavior and verbal behavior of others in the appropriate way to coping COVID-19, maybe the nonverbal behavior related to it can occur. And also we have been founding the very important way of verbal behavior in terms of immediate persuasion. I'm going to end with this graph. It's very complex. It's an experiment made by my doctoral student, Paulo Almeida. But just to show you one single subject here, and we have many illustrations of this kind of behavior. It's an experiment where the subjects, the participants, were behaving according to delayed consequences. As I explained to you, delayed consequences are less effective. As in the COVID-19, we have delayed consequences. So the first three parts of the graph, this person was behaving according to delayed consequences. He was behaving like that, the tall bars. After one or two phases, the experimenter put a rule. He told her, it's worse to do what you have been doing. So immediately the participant increased the latency of the responses. He stopped to think, and immediately he changed the pattern to a different pattern according to immediate consequences. And it happens even when the experimenter announced bad things, or when the experimenter announced good things. So change your behavior, because it's better if you change. And the participants had two choices, delayed consequence or immediate consequence. And this experiment of Paulo Almeida shows that they change immediately the pattern according to what we call verbal behavior with persuasion. It's not forever, it goes back the old pattern, but it works immediately. So if you can find this kind of change, we can sum up that in front of a fragile three-term contingencies that act upon people during COVID-19, so without the vaccine, without the drugs, the treatment, in terms of behavior, it's important to highlight the importance of persuasive, friendly, and constant language, appropriate models. For example, our federal president always didn't use the mask, so it was not appropriate model to people. And to do what FAPESP is doing today, science needs to talk to public every day, every night, every moment. If the science can, he can talk in friendly and constant way, because in this fragile contingency, language increase the power. And also because we have to learn multiple things, like the safety bell in our car, now is automatic. Why? Because we trained. So now it's automatic. Because the vaccine is coming not so soon, but maybe next year, we have to have exhaustive training in analogous situation. That's what some authors call sanitary education. You have tutorials, you have to show, you have to empower people, the professors, the teacher, to teach them how to do this kind of new behaviors. You sanitize after, before, how do you wash the foods, how do you wash everything that comes outside your place. So many details that you have to be very specialized and with 100% of correctness, right? And finally, every time we see appropriate behavior, it's important to social praise, to promote differential consequence. Even in school, TV, press, science, we have to show and to tell people the importance of consequence. And we have also to consequate, to offer social praises and differentiation consequence for appropriate and inappropriate behavior. So maybe we can discuss afterwards the role of penalties when people are not using masks, or when people are not are close to each other. And of course, these three terms with those three highlights, there are many others. For example, collective or individualist way of thinking or cultural, it's in the first term, right? So social rules. So we have to, for example, in Brazil, we have to teach collectively thinking, because people can only discuss about individual rights. And of course, hope in a near future with vaccine and drugs. So thank you very much. And my acknowledges to Jonathan and my student who helped me with the art of slides, because professors may be good or not. So thank you very much, professors and Daisy and audience, for your attention.
Thank you so much, Marta. We'll see you again at the discussion panel. Our next speaker is Dr. Paulo Sérgio Boggio, an assistant professor at Mackenzie University in São Paulo. He is the director of the Laboratory of Cognitive and Social Neuroscience at Mackenzie. Paulo Boggio background is experimental psychology and neuroscience and behavior. His research interests include cognitive, social, and affective neuroscience, and he has expertise in using non-invasive techniques to study brain activities and its relation to human behavior. Due to his research interests and expertise, Boggio became actively involved in an international network of research on COVID-19 with Dr. Jay Van Bevel, our next speaker, and many other scientists. Last May, shortly after the pandemic outbreak, their team published the article Using Social and Behavioral Science to Support COVID-19 Pandemic Response in the journal Nature Human Behavior. At this time, FAPESP was already designing this series of research webinars on COVID-19, and their work seemed to fit perfectly with our goals for this webinar. Dr. Boggio has published over 160 peer-reviewed articles and 5 books, and he has been often invited to give lectures to a diversified audience. In recent months, he has worked intensively in online dissemination and discussion of scientific information on behavior and its role in the pandemic. Dr. Boggio, thank you for your inspiring work, and please share some of it with us. The screen is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Deisy. So first of all, good morning or good afternoon, I don't know, everyone. And initially, I would like to thank Professor Luiz, Eugênio, and Deisy, and also Euclides Mesquita and Marianne Van Louis for the invitation to attend this webinar. Also, I would like to thank, there is an amazing team behind the scenes. So I'd like to thank Marcela, Roberta, Gabriela, Ana, Karina, Vera from FAPESP. They are making an amazing job. And it's a huge honor to be here with you guys. FAPESP for me is the house of science in São Paulo and in the country. So I'm truly happy to be here and discuss some ideas with you guys in the middle of the worst crisis in our generation, we can say for sure. And also I'd like to say that it's a great honor to share this session with Professor Martha Hubner, Professor John Bevel, Professor Ortwinn Renn. And so I'm really happy of being today with you guys. So let's start. So on the screen is an answer that Peter Wolleben, and the author of a beautiful book called The Hidden Life of Trees, gave in an interview. So he says something like that. So I will read this. Each tree fights for each other, so the whole forest will survive. Every tree is interested in keeping its neighbors alive because together they create a spatial climate which is cool, which is humid, where every tree feels comfortable. So he talks about trees, but that applies to humans too. So the idea is, oh, I'm sorry, I forget to share my screen. Sorry, guys. Let me say here. I'm sorry. So here we go. I think it's now working. I'm sorry, guys. So, there is this answer from Peter Wolleben about the life of trees, and it also applies to humans too. So today I will talk about the role of social science and behavior in fighting the pandemic. Without a vaccine, without adequate treatment, coping with this crisis depends heavily on behavioral changes. So we are going to talk about that. So let's go back some months, and particular in March. In March, several dates were remarkable for me. At that time, I think most of you in Brazil, there was much debate about whether university would stop or not. Some at that time had already stopped it. Mine stopped it on March 14. And I remember it well because it's my wife's birthday and we had planned a party. Obviously, we canceled it. And the tension that week was great. And while I was trying to stay calm, cope with the situation, an email came in from Professors Rob Wheeler and Jay Van Bevel, and it was an invitation. It was an invitation to several research. Basically, the main goal of this invitation was to write a paper, present different topics from the social and human science that already had enough evidence and that could serve as support for measures to fight a pandemic that was taking place in the world at that time. So here you can see, this is the paper. Professor Deisy comment earlier about it. And it was quite intense, highly cooperative, and the work that culminated in the paper. As you can see, there is a huge list of authors, and it covers areas such as psychology, sociology, political science, neuroscience, and many others. So the idea was to review the evidence from social and behavioral science that could support the fight against the pandemic. And in this, here you can see a summary of what this article has covered. We discussed topics like threat perception, leadership, individual and collective interests, science communication, social context, stress, and coping. And of course, I'm not going to talk about all these topics, and I will discuss just some of these topics. In particular, I will focus on individual and collective interests, science communication, and leadership. So let's start with the individual and collective interests. So in a pandemic, solutions then come out of individualist actions. Professor Matter said something about it, as well as Professor Renn. And if the goal is to promote cooperative, collective, and global effort, it's crucial to understand the relationship between individual gain and losses versus collective gain and losses. It's common to think that the gain of one person requires a loss for the other. That's what we call zero-sum thinking. So someone loses for the other to win. But let's just think a little bit. So how is that thinking if you want to solve global problems such as the pandemic, or we could talk about climate change or any other challenge for humanity? If we stop to think even quickly and simplistically, it becomes evident that the sum's nature in a pandemic or in a climate change or anything like global like this situation is different from zero. For example, a person infection is a threat to him and everyone else. So there is the loss of one is the loss of another. So the sum is negative. And the reverse is true, of course. The gain of one, for example, through adherence to public protection policies, is the gain of the other. So I gain and the other gain, so the sum is positive. So thinking just on this particular issue, accumulating, for example, protective materials like masks and disinfectants or even vaccines, beyond what's needed, beyond what's necessary, can be counterproductive. So access to treatment and planning the distribution of the vaccine must also consider that the sum cannot be zero. So in other words, it's useful to raise awareness among leaders with the power to define and implement health policy and the population in general, that taking care of one means take care of the other. So when we're talking about preventive measures, they are a benefit for yourself and the other. And it's interesting to think about this, because when I refer to that, I'm not just referring to each leader's isolated role within his nation. I also refer to the position of the government about another, so one nation in relation to another nation. So we could think, for example, about the role of rich countries concerning other. We can think of this in terms of social justice. And personally, this would be enough, so for me, to explain the collaboration between nations. It's interesting. There is a thought that I always had in my childhood, and still these days. Who would I be if I had been born elsewhere? So, for example, in a place with fewer resources. So I don't know if you have this kind of thoughts. I have this kind of thoughts a lot, and my childhood, I have these kind of thoughts a lot. And years later, when I around 18, 19 years old during my undergrad, I come across the philosopher John Rawls' texts and his experiment on the veil of ignorance. So it was, I need to say, it was a kind of moment of revelation to myself. And I think we could solve many problems, or at least minimize, if you think about social justice, considering that we are totally ignorant about who we are. And there are many papers showing these things. But let's talk to people that don't think in this way, and that just thinking about their own gains and thinking on zero-sum game. So even for those concerned with win from those who help, it's essential to say that the game where both sides win is possible. So this article you are seeing on a screen brings the conception in which more developed countries can help each other with has fewer resources. And this is not just a sacrifice, but an economic gain, again, in the relations between countries and with an impact on local and global health. So at the end, it can be a win-win game, even for those that are interested in economic gains. So we need to think about that. Another aspect of these discussions is that we are in a situation that decisions involve life and death. So when we're talking about life and death and all these consequences, we are talking in a way, in a kind of moral decision making. So we are in a situation that some decisions enter in the field of morality. And in the case of pandemic, this has an extra ingredient because it's morality in uncertain scenarios. So we are now thinking on how to make our decisions in a situation that sometimes things are not so clear. So let's think in a simple way. For example, like, will my social interaction infect other people? So people can think about this kind of things. Or can I get infected because the other I'm interacting with isn't following health guidelines? Or why should I sacrifice myself and stay isolated for months at home if I'm not part of a risk group? If you can say that, so just to say. So when I start thinking about these things and we went to the literature, some very, very ingenious experiments have tested the role of uncertainty in decision making involve the health of others. So let's think, imagine that you are sick and there is an uncertain risk of contaminating your colleagues or coworkers. So would you go to work? Just think for a while. Are you going to work? So I don't know, you have a flu and you are not feeling so bad and you need to decide if you're going to work or not. And it's not clear that you're going to contaminate your colleagues. So would you go to work? When you look in this paper show that is in the screen, this does show that people are less willing to make sacrifice for others when the benefits are uncertain. So now let's think in a different way. Now think that when going to work is at risk, is still uncertain, but there is a risk of infecting an elderly colleague who would suffer a severe illness. So we are still in the domain of uncertainty, but now the risk is higher. So we can contaminate an elderly colleague, coworker, and they will suffer quite hard. So what now? In this case, participants reported that they would be more willing to stay at home. So here's, in a sense, a fundamental message about how we can inform people and guide people to make their decisions. It's not, of course, to promote panic, but you need to inform properly people. And of course, inform, but also show how to deal with it. So show to people and send messages about their self-efficacy. One thing that happens when we make some actions and we make some decisions is that it starts creating our reputation. So our actions in somehow define our identity, and not just our identity for ourselves, but our identity for others. We can call like social identity. So we are creating our reputation. And think about decisions that people can look at it and say, oh, this guy is being selfish, or this guy is being pro-social or altruistic. In this scenario now, we are not just talking about social identity, but we are talking about moral identity. So now we are talking about a special aspect of who we are. So are we moral persons? Are we concerned about the life of others? So it's interesting to know that many studies show that positive reputation can impact the exchange of coordinated action and the resolution of complex social and health problems. We are going to see this in the next slide. We are now analyzing some data about the role of moral identity in adhering to policies to combat the pandemic. And it looks that having a positive moral identity internalization positively predicts our behaviors to fight the pandemic and negatively predict our beliefs on conspiracy theories. So it's quite important to understand this scenario also in terms of morality. One important question is, okay, it looks like it's important to cooperate, to foster collective behaviors, but how can we foster cooperation? So what can we do to mobilize people to collective and cooperative behaviors? There are several strategies that we can implement. And in general, when you look to the experiments testing this, usually people use economic games such as the dictator game, ultimatum game, public goods game, prisoner dilemma, so many different games to test ways to promote cooperation and altruism. And it's interesting, Professor Mata said something about that, about reinforcing and showing the value of people's actions. And there are many papers showing that. So among the techniques that increase cooperation are those that reward those who cooperate. And furthermore, informing and valuing people who cooperate increase their chance of continuing to cooperate and also increase the likelihood that other people will also cooperate. So basically knowing that other people are cooperate increase cooperations. So in this way, it's too important to provide clues about it. It's also important to provide clues that make the morality of action more salient. So for example, like asking them to report what they think is morally right thing to do. So thinking about what is a moral person, you think. So there are lots of experiments showing that this kind of approach enhance cooperation and altruism. But also there is a problem. There is the other side of the coin. The increase in the number, for example, of the free riders and the lack of sanctions against them can reduce cooperation, even in those who have been cooperating. So putting all this together is really important to leaders and the media to promote cooperation by highlighting pro-social behaviors. We need to show people the good behaviors. But the problem is that these days we have another issue to deal. So I work with EEG and other many neuroscientific techniques. And one thing that we are all the time concerned about is the ratio of signal to noise. So do we have enough signal? Is there a lot of noise? How can we solve these questions? And this is a problem not just for the labs, but for society. So one of the biggest problems these days that become more and more challenging to extract signal in the middle of lots of noise. And here I'm talking about communication. So it has become difficult even to know what a signal is. And many conspiracy theories have been accepted as factual information. But you need to know that conspiracy theories are not new, and they are not new even in an epidemic. If you look at the Black Death, for example, one of the conspiracy theories at that time was that Jews contaminated the water and spread the disease. So this is not new, but the problem is that now it's huge, and the social media and the social tools that we have facilitate the propagation of this message. So why people believe on conspiracy theories? And why people are believing that it's a Chinese virus, why people, not in terms of origin, but that there is, for example, a manipulation, there is the idea of destroying the capitalism or something like that. So why people believe on these kind of things. So one of the aspects that conspiracy theories have helped some people to understand phenomena of great magnitude like this pandemic, and that require great cognitive engagement in order to understand what is happening. So that is, for many people, it's easier to accept explanations that are easy from a cognitive point of view, even if unreal. And in addition, believing conspiracy theories is related to personal characteristics and as well as political partisanship. If anyone wants to read a nice paper talking about the psychology of conspiracy theories, I suggest this paper here from Karen Douglas, Rob Sutton, and Alexandra Sichoka. One of the problems that we can have like silly conspiracy theories, silly fake news, but we have some conspiracy theories that can have damaging consequences, and vaccine is one of them. And also many conspiracy theories are increasing polarization, are increasing prejudice, and many other things. So what can we do to deal with this? So how can we break these echo chambers? There are some experiments that I think they are quite cool, and I will comment on one. It's called a kind of it's a kind of gamified inoculation. This game is called Bad News Game. So on the screen you're seeing my alter ego is spreading fake news all over the world. So it's funny. It's dangerous, but it's funny. By going to the site, you register and you start working together with a kind of evil mentor. So I have amazing mentors during my master and my PhD, but I need to say that this mentor is quite bad. And so the idea is that he will teach you all the tricks to become a skilled propagator of fake news, of conspiracy theories, and even you learn how to destroy reputations of people. It will teach you what you need to do to attract loyal followers, and also to create fake profiles and amplify your network with bots. What kind of messages are more convincing, how they should be presented, anything. I need to say that in the beginning, I was a terrible student. There was a moment that there was an option that I need to choose, and the option that I chose was, is it ethical to spread some news? And then my evil mentor just say, oh, come on, you are not in the right place. So you need to focus on my lessons. And then I keep doing my lessons, and it turned out that I became a great student, got all these badges. So I'm now a guy that has impersonation, conspiracy, trolling, discrediting, emotion, polarization, lots of followers. But what is all this for? So what? It's interesting. Before and after this training, you're assessed on your ability to distinguish between fake news and real news. In general, we believe that it's quite easy to distinguish. I need to say that I thought before that I was quite, as a psychologist, come on, how can I believe on some news? And then I found out that I'm not so good to distinguish between fake and real news. But surprisingly, after this training with doses of fake news inoculation, my capacity improved. So we can call it like a fake news vaccine. It's interesting, these authors, they have tested in several groups, including kids in schools, and the tool has been shown to be quite effective. So we are now seeing some interesting ways to make people more ready to understand and to detect fake news. I know I'm almost done with my presentation. And as we're talking about messages, it's important not just know how to fight fake news, so what I call reduce the noise, but also we need to improve signal quality. And improving signal quality will increase, of course, the persuasiveness of the messages. This area has a very robust literature showing that the more a source is perceived as reliable, the more persuasive the message will be. So in other words, the first steps to have leaders and credible figures to take the message to the population. And basically the credibility stems from how reliable and specialized they are considered. There are several examples during the Ebola crisis, many examples that we could look. And it's not just about the leader, but also about the role of the message, which message we are showing to the people. Professor Mata said something about that. So we have the individual and the collective interest, we have the messages, and now we have the leader, and then we are in a big trouble with some leaders and not with others. So I think I don't need to say anything else just by showing these two guys here. So how is the best leader? How is the best leader to tell people what is happening, how to motivate people to focus on what is needed to do, on how to adhere to the public policies, to hand washing and all these things. So again, here we have many examples of leaders in Sierra Leone, and here I'm talking about the Ebola crisis. And we're not just talking about national leaders, we're talking about the relation between the national, the states, and even the community leaders. So some groups, we need some religious leaders, some community leaders. I wrote something with Aline Midley, and Aline Midley is the news anchor of Global. And we wrote something about it, showing some communities in Brazil that were not receiving the needed support from the authorities, and how they organize the fight against the pandemic. And basically it was based around some community leaders that have local voice, that amplify the messages and help build the confidence to encourage behavioral changes. And here there are some other thoughts about the role of the leaders, but basically what many studies show, that people tend to prefer leaders that cultivate a sense that we are all in this boat together, we are all in this together. So to promote a collective sense, so to promote a sense of us instead of sense of just me and my small group. I wrote something about that in this blog here. Is a blog from Nature. It's called Behavior and Social Science blog from Nature. And I talk about the inner moral circle of some presidents. In particular, I talk about the Brazilian president and how his focus on his reduced moral circle. So they are more focused on his families and not in the whole population. And this is a problem when you are a national leadership. We are seeing these problems in Brazil, in the US, and in many countries that are not doing so well in this pandemic. Finally, I really recommend people to read this book from Professor Nicholas Christakis. It's called Blueprint, the Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. I talk about the sense of everybody being in the same boat. And it's interesting, at the beginning of this book, he presents data from several shipwrecks and which characteristics were behind those who have saved the most people and succeed. So one of the main aspects is that leadership was one of them. So captains concerned about the entire crew and who put themselves as one more in the group and who did not use their leadership position to have privilege or to use all the resources, led the group well towards its survival. And on the other hand, leaders who exploited both people and the few resources available for survival have led the groups to real catastrophes, including cases of cannibalism. So the role of the leader is really important, and we have many stories. So I'm finishing my talk, and Jay will be the next speaker, and he will talk about this international collaboration that we have on social and moral psychology, and he will present data about that. And for those interested in the papers I mentioned during my talk, so all these QR codes take you to some place. So this one here is the website of our experiment, this international collaboration. This one here takes you to a Google Drive that I put all the papers that I mentioned during this talk. So you're interested to read the papers, you can just picture this QR code. And here are the Facebook of my lab, the website of my lab, and the Twitter. So again, thank you again, Professor Deisy, Professor Luiz Eugênio, and all from FAPESP for inviting me to this so timely and important webinar. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Paulo Boggi. We'll see you again at the discussion panel. Before giving the screen to our next speaker, I'd like to remind the audience that questions can be sent to live@fapesp.br. We'll have a discussion session right after the presentations. Our next speaker is Dr. Jay Van Bevel, the leading author of the article published in Nature Human Behavior, which I and Paulo mentioned earlier. Jay is an associate professor of psychology and neuroscience at the New York University and director of the Social Identity and Morality Laboratory. He received the New York Golden Dozen Teaching Award for teaching courses on several topics in social psychology and social neuroscience. From neurons to social networks, Dr. Van Bevel research examines from a social neuroscience perspective how collective concerns, group identities, moral values, and political beliefs shape the mind and brain. His research has received several awards, and he has published over 100 academic publications. He also has extensive work in scientific dissemination, including a mentoring column entitled Letters to Young Scientists for Science magazine. He has given several talks in psychology departments and business schools across the globe, as well as academic conferences, professional events, and non-academic organizations. His research was also featured in TEDx and TED-Ed videos. The title of his talk today is For Better or Worse, the Role of Social, sorry about that, the role of social identity in the pandemic. Thank you so much, Dr. Van Bevel. The screen is yours.
Thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to talk, and it's going to be a beautiful follow-up to Paulo's presentation of some of our work, of subsequent studies and tests we've been doing to try to build off the Nature Human Behavior paper we had, to try to use those as hypotheses that we could test using methods that were really unprecedented in terms of my career, but really in terms of the scope of the type of research that we normally do in psychology. So let me walk you through it. As Paulo mentioned, there's a long tradition of thinking about the role of behavioral science during a pandemic. So one of our inspirations was this paper published in Science after the Spanish flu in 1919, talking about what were the lessons of that pandemic, and in particular, talked about all the unconscious processes that guide people to put themselves and others at risk, the need for altruistic and cooperative decision making, like Paulo talked about. And the reason that's important is because in the absence of a vaccine or a really robust medical strategy to deal with the spread of the virus and the contraction and potential mortality from the disease, is all the things that we know we need to do now to flatten the curve, which are washing the hands, avoiding crowds, minimizing travel, and so forth. And so, as Paulo said, our paper tried to generate almost hypotheses and guidelines based on the last 100 years of research across the social and behavioral sciences. But of course, these were just hypotheses because they, at that point in time, when we started writing this in March and April, was really in the early stages of the pandemic, especially in the US and Brazil. And so we hadn't yet run any studies. So this was based on, research run during Ebola, as well as other types of medical and health situations, as well as just classic psychological studies and studies in sociology and political science. And so what we wanted to do was take those and generate specific hypotheses that we could test. And one of the key things, as Paulo mentioned, was the role of leadership during a pandemic. And what you can see when you look around the world right now is you could see that some countries have handled the pandemic enormously well, almost perfectly, and others have struggled immensely. And so in many ways, it's the first time that every single national leader is being tested with the same test. And so you can do an apples to apples comparison and look at the impact of leadership, institutions, and populations at a national level to see who's been successful and who hasn't. And it can be measured, unfortunately, in terms of infections, hospitalizations, and even deaths on the scale of hundreds of thousands. We now have over 1.2 million people who've died due to the pandemic around the globe. And what we had said would be important in our paper was that identity leadership would be critical. And this is how leaders promote trust and cooperation by creating a shared sense of identity among their followers. When you're talking about a pandemic where the responses are largely at a national level, where countries are shutting borders, minimizing travel, developing policies, using national medical and scientific resources to deal with it, this often means national leadership, although in some communities it might also mean like your local religious leader or mayor. But for the most part, this has been handled at a national level. And so as Paulo mentioned, you can look around the world and see which leaders have handled it well and which have handled it badly, and just in terms of have they been able to control the pandemic in their countries and then reopen their economies. And one of the best countries in the world, as Paulo mentioned, is New Zealand. And there's been a lot of articles. This is just one, and you can see from the headline, New Zealand's Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, may be the most effective leader on the planet, especially in the way she's handled the pandemic. And she was famous for using identity leadership. She referred to New Zealanders as her team of 5 million people. In the early stages, once they had gotten the pandemic under control, she wanted to show it was safe, so she went out for brunch. But when there wasn't enough space at the restaurant for her because of the distancing that they were doing, she didn't just like take a table and get a photo op. She went outside and was going to leave because there was no space for her. And then once a table opened up and it was safe, then she went in. And so you can imagine other leaders, and we've seen other leaders in other countries who just do the photo op, even if it's risky or even if it's crowded, and are doing these types of events that are signaling the wrong modeling of the behavior, or they're signaling that they get to play by a different set of rules. And those are clear violations of good identity leadership. One place where you have seen that, unfortunately, is where I am in the United States. You've seen we've handled the pandemic. We have more deaths than any other country on earth, even though by many accounts, we have amazing research teams, world-class universities, leaders in vaccination and pharmaceuticals, and still have failed terribly and catastrophically, and over 230,000 people have died already in the US. And so why are you seeing these differences? And I bring this up not just because Paulo brought it up, and because it's been in the news, but because Donald Trump has brought it up. In fact, he's accused New Zealand's Jacinda Ardern of having a big surge and failing on this. So we're able to look at this around the world. And so what you've seen in the US, in contrast to the way New Zealand has handled it, is instead of thinking about it at a national level, how it's really broken out in the US is at a partisan level. So Trump's party, the Republicans, have taken the pandemic much less seriously than Democrats. And if you're following the election, we're about to find out who the new president is. The data is coming in as I'm giving this talk. I might know by the end of this session. But what you've seen is that Democrats in every single state very early on expressed more concern about the pandemic than Republicans in every single state. So there's no overlap whatsoever, especially in the early stages of the pandemic, when it was starting to spread throughout the country in terms of how they were psychologically treating it. Of course, there was some evidence that if you look at Google searches, in the early days, maybe Democrats are taking it more seriously, but maybe as the pandemic spread, Republicans maybe became more aware of it and were doing Google searches for, washing their hands more and stuff like that. And so it was hard to tell if these surveys that you see on the left were predicting what was going to happen, or people's Google searches for things like hand sanitizer on the right were a better clue about how people were thinking about it. Were they all on the same page nationally at that point? And I wrote about this in early March in the Washington Post, saying that if we do have this polarization, it could be really deadly if we can't agree on the basic facts about risks, and if that doesn't change our behavior, we can have people disproportionately dying in certain parts of the country. And so I have a paper that just came out on Monday on this, also in Nature Human Behavior, where we tracked 15 million people using smartphones every day for several weeks to see how they were moving. Were they actually limiting their movement compared to the previous year, as public health guidelines suggested, or were they continuing to move freely around the places that they lived? And this is really key because, as you know, this type of data has been used to track how the virus has spread around the world, because we can see from travel numbers and the smartphone data to see, and epidemiologists have been using this to track people. So we thought we could use this for our social behavioral science question, and then see if it has outcomes, weeks and months later for increases in infections and mortality rates. And what we found just overall, as you go up the y-axis here, higher numbers mean more distancing. And so in the very early stages of the pandemic, people weren't distancing very much compared to the previous year. But as you got into April, you can see that distancing goes up in general. But once the summer started and people felt more safe because we kind of flattened the curve, they no longer distanced. They started to go out and travel and visit friends and family again. And so by the end of our study, which was after Memorial Day in the US, which was kind of the start of summer, you could see that people were no longer engaging any distancing. And if you broke that out between parts of the country that supported Trump in the last election versus parts of the country that supported his Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton, what you saw was just a consistent pattern that Democrats were engaging in distancing more than Republicans. And that started to be very small at the beginning, but in fact, it got that partisan gap. These two different identity groups got bigger and bigger as our study went on. And again, this is 15 million people in over 3,000 counties. This is huge data, the biggest data set I've ever worked with, and it's real behavior. We then looked at what happened a couple weeks later. Were people getting infected in those counties that weren't distancing? And were they dying more? And so we looked at the growth of infections and mortality in the time after. So it takes time to contract the virus, show symptoms, get tested. And then usually that has a time lag of about 10 days to 2 weeks. And then there's an additional time lag of those people who end up being sick enough, they often go into the intensive care unit, get put on oxygen, and then many of them die. And so what we saw is that counties that voted for Trump over Clinton in 2016 exhibited 14% less distancing, which is the data I already showed you. But maybe the most striking finding is that those counties that didn't engage in distancing were the ones who had the highest spike in infections and mortality weeks later. And so what we're seeing here is a pathway between these types of identities leading to very different behaviors at a massive national scale, and then that leading to the spread of the pandemic and even deaths. So there's a question, of course, is this an identity? We talked about in our paper about this being an identity issue, or is this something about political ideology? In the US, the people who vote for Trump and are Republican tend to be more conservative. And so you might think, is this just something about the conservative mind or personality style? But if you look back, for example, to how Americans responded during the previous epidemic, which was Ebola, you saw, if anything, the opposite pattern, that conservatives were more concerned about Ebola than liberals. So Republicans were more concerned at that point than Democrats. And so this is the opposite of what we found here. And the reason we think is because a different president, Barack Obama, was in office. And so what this suggests is it's really about your trust in your leader and your identity, not whether you're conservative or liberal. That doesn't seem to be predicting these behaviors at all. And then if you zoom back out of the American context and look globally, you can see the consequences for this. If you have half of a country not taking the pandemic seriously, what you can see is it adds up into death rates. And so this is the data from New Zealand versus the United States right around the time Trump was criticizing New Zealand. New Zealand had 24 deaths, and the United States at that point had 190,000 deaths. And even if you scale this by population, the United States has an order of magnitude or two worse death rate per capita than New Zealand. And this gap has only been growing as there's been about 50,000 more deaths since this time in the US. And so this shows you the consequence of this leadership style. When you're pitting people against one another in your own country and they have different versions of reality, leads to this very different types of behavior and incredibly dangerous in a pandemic. Of course, we did want to measure this globally and see maybe identity can also be used for good. And so this was a study where Paulo was the co-senior author on it and helped design it. And this was going outside of these, these two example contexts I show you, looking in 67 countries around the world. And we decided on a bunch of measures we wanted to use. And one of them was to test this issue of identity. And so we wanted to see in countries where people who are more identified with their nation, are they more likely to follow the health guidelines and engage in distancing, hygiene practices like washing their hands, minimizing crowds, as well as policy support for lockdowns and travel constraints. And so we did something that we've never done before. I've never done. And we had a team of about 8 people who designed it. And then we decided to be radically inclusive. And I posted on social media, and we had over 230 collaborators from around the world sign up to collect data in their countries. And so they translated our survey and administered it in their countries. And then we analyzed the data to see if national identity was going to have a positive effect maybe around the world. If you didn't have people in countries with different versions of reality. But we also wanted to separate identity from something like narcissism. And so national narcissism is, sometimes people have an inflated sense of national identity, like their country is better than every other country. And we wanted to see if there was kind of this healthy element of identity with a nation, and then this unhealthy element of narcissism, where you had an inflated view, very maybe aggressive view, and to them, the notion that there might be a pandemic out of control in their country would be very threatening, and so they might not have the same positive response to the pandemic. We also, in this study, measured political ideology directly. We wanted to see, is this a conservative or liberal issue or not? Because sometimes identity is correlated with this narcissistic view, or what's often called populism. And it's also correlated with conservatism. So we wanted to see, is identity driving these health behaviors or these other elements? And so here's an example of the 67 nations. We have actually now, I believe we have 68. So it's not a perfect representative sample of the whole globe, but it's massively more inclusive than pretty much any study in the history of psychology. So this was a massive step forward in how we do research. We're hoping to have international collaborations to continue this. We think this is the wave of the future to find solid, high-powered results on global issues. And here's the data. This is actually a great plot that Paulo made. What you can see here is that in every single country that we measured, the extent to which people are nationally identified, so identified with their nation, so Brazilians who care deeply about Brazil, Americans who care deeply about America, Canadians or New Zealanders who care deeply about their country, they're more likely to do all of these health behaviors. In particular, we find that they're willing to engage in less physical contact. They're more supportive of policies to make them safer. They're willing to engage in the hygiene, of washing their hands and things like that. And so even though there's variation in these countries, that is going to be something we're going to be studying for years and years, trying to understand. At a minimum, we already know that national identity is a robust predictor around the globe in all of these different countries of all of these health behaviors. If I show you it here, you can now see how it compares to things like narcissism and ideology. So political, whether you're conservative or liberal, you put these all in the same statistical model. The one thing you see is that national identification predicts all of these health behaviors in almost every country around the world. Whereas narcissism is not a very strong predictor. You can kind of see the results all over the place. Sometimes national narcissism predicts health behavior. Sometimes it makes you actually engage in risky behaviors like it does in the US. And then you can look at political ideology on the bottom. What you see is a small trend globally that liberalism is supportive of policies that would prevent the spread of the pandemic more than conservatism. But that does not account for this national identity effect. That's a different effect, and it's much smaller. So it really seems to be a story here that national identity predicts health support across the board with all the measures we had. And so it does seem like this notion that identity can be a key here. The extent to which we identify with a group and a set of leaders who are trying to make us better means that we're going to follow the recommendations and guidelines they give us during a global health crisis or certainly a national health crisis. But again, if you go back to that American context, and this is an image from a super spreader event that was held at the White House a couple months ago, where the president himself got coronavirus and many of his closest staff and supporters. And so they use, you can see almost no one here is wearing a mask. It's a massive gathering. There's no distancing. They also went inside after, which we now know is incredibly dangerous because aerosol is the primary mechanism of transmission for COVID. And so this is the type of signal that you send to the public, that you don't care about the guidelines, you're not going to follow them, you're above them, and your people who identify with you and your party are probably going to be less likely to go along with it. So in this case, polarization can lead to incredible risks if leaders make bad decisions and engage in unhealthy behaviors. And countries, and I'm just going to pull out another one because I'm Canadian. This doesn't have to be the case. So in Canada, in addition to New Zealand, Canada's right across the border from the US, very similar in terms of its wealth, culture, and a lot of other things. Researchers there found that the leaders across the political spectrum, from liberal to conservative, were publicly on social media talking about the importance of the pandemic and these health behaviors. And so you could measure this in their tweets and social media posts. And then when you looked at polls of Canadians, it didn't matter whether you were on the left or the right. You tend to support the public health behavior.
Sorry, Jay, we lost your audio. Okay.
Okay, I can hear you. I guess you can't hear me.
Now I'm hearing you. Okay.
I'm done my talk.
Okay.
I just finished.
Sorry. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Van Bevel, for sharing your ideas and your timely research. Now we are going to the discussion and closing remarks. I will ask the speakers to unblock their cameras so that we can have a question and answer session. As you can see, the topics are quite well related, and we have received some interesting questions, and I will direct them to you. But since Dr. Renn will have to leave soon, I hope he can stay with us for a few minutes, and I'll direct him the first question, which is the following. We have recently seen violent protests in European countries against lockdown and other restrictive measures. You mentioned that in your talk. This may be the origin of serious social crises, in addition to those specific to the pandemic. Do you envisage strategies to change this scenario? Who should act? Do social and behavioral scientists have a role to play in this situation, or is the problem beyond their reach?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for this very powerful and very interesting question. I mean, it would take a long time to really respond to it in all due necessary diligence. However, I'll give you a very few thoughts on this. What we could see almost in all countries, and I'm very happy also listening to the last talk about national identity and other factors, is that the kind of communication between the policymakers and the public was very often mediated through scientists. And even in those countries like Brazil or United States and others who have a fair, strong autocratic leadership, they could not afford not to base their recommendations on something that they labeled as science. And even if they didn't like the scientists, and they exchanged the scientists, but in the beginning, virologists and epidemiologists really were very strong on the scene, and everybody was really putting a lot of emphasis that you have to be based on science. During the dynamic of the crisis, we could see now it has shifted towards the issue of what is proportional in terms of measures, given on one hand the infection and its impact, and on the other hand, economic, social, or political losses of closing schools, closing businesses, and all kinds of things. Now, I think all over the world we can see that the prominent role that virologists and the epidemiologists had in the first phase was not replaced by new scientists coming in, the behavioral scientists, economists, sociologists. Yes, they were consulted, but they never had this prominent role that the virologists have and still have. And I think that's interesting. As soon as we can see that there is something like a disinterested science, which just counts like, who is going to be affected and what can you do to decrease the risk, there was an almost universal appeal to natural science in a sense. Now, when it comes to be more sophisticated, when we run into wicked problems in which we have to have trade-offs between different competing goals, the role of scientists has again decreased. And it's much more now a political gambling. And if you look at the various countries that we've just seen, and we've seen New Zealand, we've seen Japan, Taiwan, China doing very well, and other countries doing fairly badly. But in all of these countries, we have this struggle on how to make good trade-offs between, losses on both sides, or if you think the common denominator is saving pain, whether it's more economic pain or more social pain versus medical pain. And then in there, I think behavioral scientists have a lot to say, but they're not always asked. And that's, I think, it's an important element in terms of the science policy nexus. And I know it's different in different countries. I'm not wanting to overgeneralize it, but there is a clear tendency that as long as it was a medical problem, it was very clear that the best medical people and scientists were next to all the presidents or chancellors or whatever who was running the country. Now, when it goes to more proportionality issues and judgments, we can see that it becomes more an issue of political framing, more an issue of left-right positioning, and other factors that we just heard about.
Thank you so much, Dr. Ortwinn. Now there is a question for everyone. Thank you all for your excellent presentations. Here is my question. Suppose I am the mayor of a medium-sized city where the population is divided and polarized in their political positions, and COVID-19 cases are increasing, both contamination and deaths. If I could consult with you with so much knowledge, what would be your concrete recommendations for immediate implementation? It's yours.
Yeah, okay, thank you very much. I mean, it depends a little bit, are you asking what the mayor should do or what the scientists should do? Let me express it in terms of the mayor. I mean, if I were the mayor of the city, I can see that the city is divided in two different parts, or the ones that believe the virus is not very important, the other ones believe it's really very dangerous. The one thing I think what one can do, and actually, I think there are some success stories there, is to really have an appeal to those who feel they're invulnerable to say, yes, you are invulnerable and we believe you get away with it very easily, just like President Donald Trump got away with this. So if you believe you can get away with it, but maybe others not, and you're a transmitter. So if you want to be a very responsible citizen in your town, we know you fine and you will recover soon, but you may be a transmitter for the virus to somebody else, maybe to some elderly people. And do you really want to be a transmitter? Is that something that you would feel comfortable with? So why don't we all take some action of precaution? Not for you if you don't think you need it, but it's for the others. And I think this could be a powerful message that could help also to get over that polarization within the city.
Thank you, Dr. Ortwinn.
Yeah.
What else?
I would like to comment something. Yeah, so as a major, what can you do? So looking at research, for example, we know that, for example, different groups, if a member of a group, there is rival for another group, if you start showing that they can talk, that they can be even friends, they can share some values and some goals, we increase the cooperation between these two groups. So if you are a major of a city and you have two polarized groups, you can probably show people that you can respect the other side, the other party, the other group, the other team. You can discuss ideas with that. So if we're in agreement that you are a nice major that are fostering the public goods and you are fostering a good society. So that's the problem of some leaders today. They are assuming a selfish position and not talking to the others. So if you see, for example, in US, we have some senators showing that, yes, there was a time that we Democrats and we Republicans, we could lunch together, we could share some ideas, so this could show people and show the population that it's possible to find a common goal, a common target to deal with together, not separated. And there are some papers showing this kind of things.
Yeah. Can I comment? Can I?
Please,
okay. It's a very interesting question. First of all, I will imitate New Zealand president. The behavior of her is amazing. I would do, as Paulo, Boggio, and Collaborate say in their paper, an overarching leadership. I would look forward for leaders, local leaders, religious leaders, politician leaders, different parties. I would do a meeting and with administration guys, high-tech guys, politicians and local leaders, scientists, and I would create a system to talk every day to people, like the state government of São Paulo is doing every day at noon. They give data, but I would arrange persuasion talks from different leaders, and I would call them to agree to a wider goal, which is to survive. So let's create a surviving talk. And afterwards, besides giving economical assistance to people, I would create tutorials and a system of award. For example, if São Paulo was attaining 50% of compliance of staying home in the beginning of the pandemic. So the government can create an award system to the city, which is following the rules of the moment. So an award system to people who are following the rules. So I would do a group way of being. I mean, let's create different leaders, different talks, but with the same goal. It's not easy, but I would put scientists, politicians, different leaders all together every day.
Thank you, Marta.
You're welcome, dear.
Anyone else on this question?
Sure, I'll add to that and say one thing you could do is have not only the mayor, but if the mayor has a political opponent in another party, they could go up and present it together with, I think, with a scientist. That might be something that would help in a polarized environment, is showing that no matter what their background, they all stand for the same thing, and that they have a scientist there that they're standing behind. And then the other thing I would say is that, at least in the US and some other countries, the way it's often framed is you're trading off your health on one hand. So we could do what the health experts say, or we could open up the economy and you could keep your job. But what the data now says, and economists overwhelmingly agree, is that if you do things like wear a mask, we actually can, and we actually prevent and flatten the curve and minimize the spread of the pandemic, the economy opens up faster, schools can stay open. And all of these, you can get your childcare so you can actually do your job. And so what you want to do is say that these goals are actually all aligned, that there's not a trade-off between doing public health stuff and opening the economy, that doing the public health stuff allows for freedom. If you wear a mask, you can start to travel everywhere and interact with people. If you minimize the spread of the pandemic, you can keep schools and businesses open and more aggressively. And so that's one thing I think that's a message that should be able to be communicated across the political spectrum, that helps kind of make everybody get on the same page, that we're all in together. All of these things are actually aligned. And if we all do the right behavior, we can be like New Zealand, which is they have opened the economy, and other countries like Taiwan has done really well. Those countries are actually flourishing on most dimensions, not just health, but in terms of schools are open and they have access to restaurants and other things.
Thanks, Jay. I have another question. I think we have time for one more question. The pandemic taught humanity about collective action and major change of behavior at all levels, individual, family, work, and so on. It seems language interpretation is the major bottleneck. How can we improve communication? Do we need to develop a common international language to communicate with all people?
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is a very important task. I think that since we all are connected with each other, I think the way that the global communication is actually occurring has a major impact on the credibility of the sources in the national or regional level. What we can see is that, at least in Germany, and I see it also in many European countries, and I would be very happy to know more about Brazil or United States and Canada in this way. We have seen that the number of people believing in conspiracy theories is directly correlated with the trust in the competence of the regional and national governments. And the regional national governments' trust is again very much also correlated with the confidence that the national regional governance is in line with the universal teaching of science and the universal teaching of the world leaderships. And so there's an interesting connection there that people who lose trust because they feel their regional government is not in line anymore with what globally is known, refer much more and more frequently to conspiracy theories or other kinds of very strange sources of knowledge. And so that's something where I think we need to be much more careful also in general terms. And I think that learning from nations like New Zealand, I mean, which has been mentioned here several times, how to do this. I mean, it's easier with an island, we have to say, because, you know, immigration is not a big problem there. But nevertheless, you know, they have been very strict, and a high compliance rate has helped. And if and those kind of messages we got to get across. And if you are living somewhere else where people are dying in large numbers, and you blame the leadership, you either, you know, get very devastated in the way that you see the reality, or you start to think about, you know, there must be some evil behind it. And then we get back to the conspiracy theory. QAnon is just one of those examples that have become very popular. So I think there's a lot at stake here. And I think going along with a very good international and even global communication effort to make things more consistent with what we know, but also more consistent with what is effective is a very important element to pursue.
Thank you. Anyone?
I'll just say I agree with all that. I thought that was perfectly said.
Very good. Well, I think I'll try one more question. We have lots of good questions. I'll see if we can send them. Our speakers agree, we could send the questions, and if they can answer, we try to send the answers back to the persons who send the questions. So I'll finish with one for Dr. Marta Hübner. It's from Ramon Marin from UFSCar. Thank you for your great presentation, Dr. Marta. Considering your expertise, when we think about services for the autistic population, we can't take aside the economic and cultural differences between Brazil and the USA, which produce a substantial part of scientific evidence. How do you think we can face this difference in intervening without taking in account our cultural and social aspects and limitations into account?
Did he mention a specific service, Professor David? No, general.
That's general.
Yes, well, of course, cultural difference are in part of the contingency all of the speakers here mentioned. So Brazil, for example, is a culture that loves to hug, loves to kiss, loves to be very close to each other. So it's a challenge to teach us how to be part of people, how to be physically distant. So one of the challenges. Economical problems. Of course, we have a huge problem with the people who lost informal jobs, who doesn't have access to schools. And so we have a correlation between not reading science, not listening to science, and the compliance with the COVID-19 appropriate behavior. So the global channel in Brazil, the major one, it's, I wouldn't believe I would say this, but TV Global News is doing an amazing job every day in the very highest audience time, talking to people every day, the good things about COVID, the good things. I mean, the good appropriate behavior, the inappropriate behavior, the contradictions, but what to do. And at the end of the everyday newspaper, people, normal people, people of daily life, doctors and patients and teachers, they are talking about the suffering part and the recovering part. So I think communication here is one of the huge tools So we have to communicate in daily language, in very easy language. And this channel I'm mentioning here, they call every day scientists, politicians and doctors and patients and normal people to talk about the main rules. So we have many challenges here in the country, but I think the communication system, the mass media, is playing an important role among all. So they are spreading the news of science. They are presenting the good persuasion talk, what we have to do day by day. But it's not the contingency indeed. I mean, it's not the consequence. The consequence is the worst part, because if you go without mask, you feel the air, you are more reinforced immediately. So the challenge is individually, and the challenge is cultural defined.
Thank you, Marta. Well, I wish we could continue this talk. It's very interesting. But as I said, the talks will be on YouTube, so we can go back to them and learn more with all the four of you. Thank you so much again. It was a great time here listening to you all. In closing this panel, I would like to comment that today, when science is being so poorly understood, discredited, and even attacked by some segments of our society, FAPESP's COVID-19 research webinar series shows how scientists around the globe are prepared and ready to react to unknown problems, trying to find solutions. Until December 2019, we knew nothing about the new coronavirus, SARS-CoV-2, but science in all areas was prepared to try to understand, predict, and control various aspects of this disease, from genes to complex social behaviors, from molecular analysis to sophisticated technological resources to process big data, from nanoparticles to protective fabrics for masks or clothes. We saw the scientific community working together to achieve unprecedented scientific developments in such a short period of time. The promise of a vaccine conceived and developed by science seems increasingly close, and it will certainly become a powerful helper in the fight against COVID-19. There is certainly still much to learn, and we may need more time for this promise to become a reality. However, from the very beginning, it was clear how much human behavior and collective human behavior is the instrument at our disposal today to deal with this pandemic, including the behavior of scientists. This webinar added to the previous ones this important component of the social and behavioral sciences, which in fact have been contributing to support the response to COVID-19 pandemic. Just one more word. For science to keep alive and working, we need that the labs keep active. We need the labs well equipped with enough sufficient supplies. And most of all, we need scientists with a safe job so that they can keep working and doing their job continuously, so they can keep ready for the challenges that we face in this complex world. And most of all, we have to continue preparing new generations for continuing the research work. So thank you very much for your attention.